So we're just giving it a minute until everyone arrives. Wonderful to see such great attendance, and welcome to this event, which is exploring queer joy as a digital good. My name is Rima Patel. I'm a co-investigator of the Digital Good Network. I'm moderating the session. Happy Pride Month. I think that's the important thing to say, and what glorious weather for it as well. So we've got some fantastic speakers who are speaking to various of our Digital Good Network projects, and I'll let them introduce themselves. What I'll do is I'll hand on to Lexi, who will introduce themselves, and then we'll sort of pass the baton on. So over to you, Lexi.
Thank you, Rima, and thanks again for the invitation. So I'm Lexi Webster. I'm an associate professor of digital culture at the University of Southampton and nominally the principal investigator for Queer Joy's Digital Good. However, our approach was far more distributed in its leadership. So I have brought along two of my incredible colleagues today who are as much leaders in this project. So I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves before we get to the main meat of the presentation today. So first, Genavee.
Hi, I'm Genavee Brown. I am an assistant professor in the psychology department at Northumbria University. And my work focuses on examining queer relationships and how people use the internet to maintain those and find queer joy online. And now I'll hand over to Maddy.
Hi, I'm Maddy. I'm an assistant professor at University College Dublin in Ireland, and my research broadly focuses around how people express identity online, assign identity to technology, and then how that impacts kind of cognitive processes around that. So lots of random things. But I'll pass you back to Lexi, and if you'd let me know when you want to move on slides.
Fantastic. Yes, Maddy is acting as Chief Scientific Advisor today and doing the slide sharing so that I can see, because as you can see, I'm currently in an outdoor space and I don't have several screens. Maddy does. So thank you, Maddy, for that. And those introductions really lend themselves to introducing the project in the sense that all of our research at the point that we had started developing this project was kind of miserable. So I'm going to take us through, first of all, finding joy by finding the team, and then I'm going to talk a bit more about the project. So if you want to just go to that first slide, Maddy, so that we can see that table full of wonderful collaging. The Queer Joy as a Digital Good project started in the first sandpit for the Digital Good Network. I found myself in a room with, I think, about 10 other researchers, a virtual room, with about 10 other researchers who we all were interested in the theme of gender, generally. I think was the first theme we found ourselves in. And we had a good old chat and a good old natter. And then we were moved to the next room and we were all in the next room as well, because we'd all picked the second topic, which I can't remember what that was about. But we had some really good conversations, particularly focused on, we were particularly focused on this idea of queerness. So bringing in this, this theme across our research and LGBTQIA+ studies in an interdisciplinary perspective. But we'd also talked about how a lot of our research is, or can be, fairly miserable in its content, largely because of the sort of gestures widely terrible landscape we find ourselves in the world over, in relation to queer politics and social acceptance. So we really sort of tagged onto this idea of joy as something meaningful that we could contribute. So we're talking about relationships. Obviously, we find joy in relationships, but often we see difficulties in relationships as related to or caused by external factors. If we talk about identities, often we can find joy in identity, but we also see misery in how other people respond to those identities. And my own research it was about transphobia online for a very long time. And of course, that is, I mean, all sorts of miserable. But joy is something that we decided to seek with our project, not just for our participants, but also for ourselves. We really latched onto this idea of the digital being something that is joyful. And that was something that was prompted, I think, by the Digital Good Network, in the sense that the impetus was to focus not just on harms, but also on benefits of digital technology. So that's the sort of preamble of how we got to joy. And I'm going to talk today a little bit about how we found joy, not just in our data, but also in the project itself. So next slide, Maddy, and I'll just briefly mention the other folks on our team. So Genavee and Maddy are with me today, but we also have Ben Dalton from Leeds Beckett, Dawn Woolley from Leeds Arts, Carolina R.A. from Northumbria, Sarah Clint from the University of Manchester, and Alice Wilson, who during the course of the project finished her PhD at the University of York with no corrections because she's incredible. And our whole team are from a wide range of disciplines, so spanning computer science, human-computer interaction, psychology, sociology, visual arts, linguistics, etc. So we really brought this idea of finding joy in interdisciplinarity together. So how might we differently conceptualize joy? How might we differently understand how to get to a better world for queer folk, particularly through the lens of digital technology? And that's where the primary objective of the project came in, which was, if we all see queer joy as being something entirely different, how might our general publics get to this notion of queer joy? And so that's what we landed on, was really thinking about, what does queer joy mean to digital media users? What does queer joy mean within the context of technology, and how might we facilitate queer joy in the future? Next slide, please, Professor Whitty. That's a real old school sort of callback to COVID. Sorry about that. Why does digital queer joy matter? Well, our whole purpose was really thinking about how joy is a determiner of social health. And we were really thinking about this idea that platforms are either healthy or not, for how far they facilitate joy. And we foregrounded joy, particularly queer joy, as something that is a practice of resilience for individuals and for communities amidst this rising tide of transphobia and queerphobia more broadly. What we thought 2 years ago was, oh, this is the pinnacle of queerphobia. We were wrong, evidently. But hopefully the work that we've done in not just finding joy, but also trying to push joy on others will provide some remedy to that kind of that need for resistance, that need for resilience, to allow people to find joy in their own research, whether they're queer or not, to find their own queer joy, whether they're queer or not, but also to just experience the positive aspects of digital technologies rather than focusing on the harms. Next slide, please, Maddy. And of course, my colleagues Genavee and Maddy will be sort of jumping in as and when they think that I'm saying something ridiculous or that they want to add something meaningful. And this is just a bit of a context about how we got to this project around joy, of course, or digital spaces for LGBT folk, primarily because they're often a lifeline for folks who are isolated, or whether that's geographically or socially. And also they offer opportunity, and that's really where we were getting to, the barriers and opportunities of technology for facilitating joy, particularly in how the mechanisms of platforms allowed for the facilitation of joy or not. And again, this was informed by a lot of the research we do, because we all do work on various digital media. You can hear people laughing. I apologize. They're enjoying their coffee. Next slide, please, Maddy. And so we were really thinking about, how do we get to a point where we not only understand what queer joy is for digital media users, but also to develop this standard for platforms and policymakers in how to facilitate queer joy. So a lot of my research was on Twitter, X, and how much of an absolute sort of flaming hellhole it is. But we also did some other research as a team. Some of our researchers do work with Instagram, for example, with Meta. And so we were well attuned to this idea that platforms and the companies that underpin those platforms don't do what they should, and often work counter to facilitating queer joy. But we were also recognizing that as a group of people, we also were able to find joy despite those things. So looking at that juxtaposition between what is expressly facilitated and what is found despite what looks like attempts to rob us of our joy. So those were our primary aims. Next slide, please, Maddy. We had three primary work packages underpinning this project in order to get to some of those aims. So the first was a survey, and Maddy doesn't know that I'm going to do this, but I might ask them to talk about it a little bit, because the survey was primarily under Maddy's leadership, and that was really to get a sense of what does queer joy mean to users. Maddy, do you mind with your several screens?
Yeah, no worries. So I don't actually remember what the slides are. So am I moving through them or am I just vamping?
Yeah, a bit of both, just sort of like just move to the next one. Yeah.
Yeah, all right, we'll see what
Queer
we've
the
got.
idea of a presentation.
Okay, so yes, we did this survey where we were looking at what it was 100 people based in the UK and Ireland kind of conceptualized queer joy to be, how they saw it in online spaces, and about some of these platform differences. So yeah, so here's the breakdown of our participants. We did all of these demographics as open text, so everyone could self-identify, which was great, but a logistical nightmare trying to go through and code it. And like, no one spells non-binary the same way, and that really upset me because there's a way I spell it, and that's the way that we used it in the paper. But anyway, I digress. So yeah, we had quite a variety of participants taking part. And then we were asking them to what extent did they feel these different social media platforms facilitated the expression of queer joy. And so this graph shows basically where those platforms were ranked from where they defaulted in the list that we had. So they all started in the same place for everyone. And then what the mean was of the participants' final ranks. And essentially the negative numbers indicate that they were moved up the rankings as being more facilitative, whereas the ones with positive values were moved down the rankings. And we get this interesting trend where more visual platforms like TikTok and YouTube were moved up the way, whereas the more text-based platforms, and notably Twitter, which people had many opinions about, were seen as much less good at facilitating queer joy. So we had like a variety of open text questions as well to kind of understand some of those thoughts, but generally we found that the majority of our participants actually didn't say that they posted about queer joy. The majority were in the camp of they didn't post about it for various reasons. Some of that was to do with like the platform. So Elon Musk got shouted out for being terrible. And we had other people kind of say about how the audience that would see their posts is what was a barrier to them posting about queer joy. But we had others who did post some things, or some who said that they hadn't intended to post queer joy, but they posted like their wedding photos, which would hopefully be joyful. So it was quite a mixed bag in terms of that. Yeah, and then those platform differences that I went through in the graph, we found, so it was a lot of like a kind of an indication that visual mediums were seen as kind of better for queer joy. And then we had some qualitative themes highlighting kind of trends in what queer joy contains. So things like the ability to express yourself, have community, freedom, safety, all these different kind of elements. Okay, so that's well, that slide. So
I can take over from here, Maddy, if you like, so that it saves you from having to sort of remember through each of these themes, because there's quite a few of these slides that express those things. So maybe you could just move through them slowly as I discuss them in terms of what joy means to different folk. But whilst that's happening, I wanted to highlight something that I've almost forgot entirely about until Maddy delivered their Oxford Internet Institute Pride lecture last week, which was that one of our respondents to the survey said, "This isn't real research. Why are you bothering to do this? I can't believe anyone would do this." And I think that spoke a lot to the need for the research. So this idea that joy isn't something meaningful to do research on, or to do research with, and that there's a kind of resistance that we've not experienced in our in-person delivery of these kinds of things. In fact, almost everywhere that I've talked about this project, everyone leaves with a note to say, I'm going to try to find more joy in my research. But it was interesting that our participants, who, by the way, were recruited from Prolific, who had to have indicated on their profile they were LGBT plus, as part of the tagging that Prolific does for their users. But also that folks who would identify as that on these platforms, now of course we can get into the authenticity or inauthenticity of that, would also think that exploring queer joy was something that wasn't meaningful to do research on. So those things were interesting, but what our participants broadly found joy in, or identified as being joyful, was the relationships we construct with one another, particularly how we construct relationships with different spheres of other. So our local relationships, but also these broader communities, and also the relationships we contract with technologies. And Maddy mentioned that documenting relationships, documenting queer lives, was a mechanism of documenting joy, in the sense that existing despite negativity and finding love despite negativity is something that queer users found great joy in. So please, Maddy, go on.
Yeah, one of my kind of favorite examples of a queer joy post that kind of came out of it was a trans participant said that they posted a screenshot of their voice app that indicated that their voice was firmly in the male masculine range, and how that was really like affirmative for them. And as a tech nerd, I kind of like that idea of how we can use technology to really create gender euphoria and like support people's identities. So there was quite a lot of like kind of personal anecdotes which were really nice to kind of read about.
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic example, Maddy, and it might come up in a slide later. And it really is about thinking beyond, or finding joy beyond what we'd imagine. It's right there. It's Maddy, you know these slides. Finding joy beyond what we had imagined. So we were primarily talking about platforms in the context of your traditional social media. But our participants finding joy in technology beyond that context was something that was more than welcome to us, and really sort of expands on that relationality of joy, the joy we can find in relation to technology, the non-human evaluation of us as being a desired, an acquired identity, and finding joy, finding affirmation in that is something that validated our approach to say that technology can be something that meaningfully facilitates joy. Next slide, Maddy. And of course, other ways of expressing joy are, again, those visual forms, including through fashion and through colors and through language. So those ways of expressing joy that allow us to create insider communities. So showing that we belong to communities, and that could be an implicit finding of relationships and finding of joy, or an explicit way of making sense of queerness and being in and around the queer community. And of course, some of them do either reflect or challenge those kinds of established stereotypes we have in the world of pink and femininity, and also the kinds of clothes we imagine as being related to the identities we want to express and we want to have understood by others on those platforms. So the survey really gave us a grounding for understanding how users, in a broader sense, 100 users, understood queer joy, and they probably gave us as many definitions as we expected, which was more than there were users, which was also a positive thing. I saw Genavee just popped her mic off, so.
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about the workshop a bit.
Excellent, please do.
Yeah. So yeah, we wanted to continue expanding on what people perceived as queer joy, but through some more creative methods. And what was really nice was that the kind of textual responses that we had from participants in the first study reappeared in the workshop study. So we asked participants kind of three guiding questions. What does queer joy mean to you? And we actually asked them to each bring an object that represented queer joy to them. And you'll see some of those on the slides later, and I'll talk about those. How do you think other people see queer joy? Because we were quite interested in understanding if there's kind of a mismatch in how people represent queer joy themselves and how other people might assume they represent it, because this could have create issues for platforms who might think, oh, queer joy is this one thing, so we need to kind of ban or control other things that don't fall into the queer joy category. Or they might think they're doing a great job promoting queer joy when actually that's not what queer people think queer joy is. And then lastly, we asked them, if you could create an online utopia where you could express queer joy freely, what would it look like? And I'll talk a bit more about how the participants kind of transformed this question. Maddy, can I have the next slide, please? So we ran our workshop actually at the Baltic, which is a modern art museum in Newcastle upon Tyne. Lovely venue. If you've never been, it's great. It's also free. So we rented their kind of meeting space, and Ben and Dawn had cut out all these collage materials. So they'd brought pictures from old magazines and children's books. We had a lot of superhero imagery, some more vegetal things, so like mushrooms and plants and flowers. And then we also brought some just random objects like rocks and bottle caps and just pretty much anything we could get our hands on. So we had about 12 participants at the workshop who all identified as queer, and we went through those questions, as I said before. One of the interesting things that came out of those questions was the last question, where we had this image of queer joy, maybe in the same way as study one, where we thought about queer joy online as posting or expressing something. But one thing our participants came up with was this idea of community, and community being a real source of queer joy online. So one of the issues with that they talked about is that obviously the internet was great for finding connection. You know, one of our participants told me a story about that's how they met their fiance, was on Twitter because they were both sharing queer joy posts. But at the same time, there are obviously these risks for stigmatization. And there was this real tension in conversations about how do we create an inclusive space so people who need to find it can, but also protect that space from anybody who might want to cause harm. So that was a real tension that participants talked about trying to deal with themselves, with issues of like context collapse and not wanting to share things that might be seen by people we didn't intend to share them or to see them. But they also talked about ways that they could kind of like avoid context collapse through indeterminacy. So they could do things like, you know, share inside jokes or post ambiguous things that people might assume weren't queer joy posts, but the queer community might understand were queer joy posts. Next slide, please, Maddy. We also, because of the collage method that we were using, we came up with this idea of cutting together. And the definition of this is an intra-action to emphasize that distinctions and relations between things are iteratively made and remade. So in our first kind of question, we had them talk about their objects. We had participants talk about the objects they brought. And then we asked them to do a collage about queer joy. And then in the second iteration, we asked them to kind of draw what other people thought queer joy was represented by. And finally, in the last iteration, we asked them to imagine this utopia and work in pairs to create a collage. And then finally, at the end, to combine all their collages together and work together as an entire group to share ideas. And this was really interesting as a method because new things were coming up all the time. New ideas were coming up all the time as participants were kind of combining their ideas, or they'd see, oh, you used that, or you incorporated that idea. That makes me think of this. And it was really quite interesting, and it was so heartwarming to see everybody kind of sharing and being so open with each other about their experience and what they wanted the internet to be like. Can I have the next slide, please, Maddy? We also, to keep people thinking about technology, we brought these frames. So we had cut out in wood, the gold frame on the top there, for example, which is supposed to be like an iPad, but we also had some more like cell phone sized ones. And we also had these paper cutouts of phones and tablets and laptops. And we asked participants to take pictures either on their own phone, or Ben would go around with his camera that he had rented to ask them to frame their collages and take pictures of them. And one thing that was really interesting was that um, this allowed participants to kind of negotiate their visibility and anonymity, so they could, if they had brought an object that might identify them, they could cut out certain parts of it that they might not want people to see. They could also choose which photos they shared with the researchers, so we asked them to email us photos that they were comfortable sharing at the end. And then also, uh, at the end, when they had made this giant collage on the table, which was the picture you saw at the very beginning of the presentation, there was all this kind of negotiation of like whose picture goes on top and how do they fit together. That was really interesting. Trying to like, I give everyone an equal say, I think, which was really nice to see. Next slide, please, Maddy. And then finally, the last thing that kind of came out of this was about queer joy as a signal. So some of this was about context collapse and the tension around that. But they also really talked about how they used fashion and tattoos and jewelry and makeup and badges and lanyards and all sorts of different symbols to signal their queer identity to other, both in the real world and online. But many of them talked about this as kind of one, a way for other queer people to identify them and feel safe talking to them, but also as almost a provocation. So they talked about how joy was expressed in a multitude of ways. It might be love, it might be subversion of norms and anger. And it was really interesting that a lot of them talked about queer joy was necessary because it was a way of pushing back against queer phobia, as you can see in the quote here. So it was this idea that like queer joy is a way of fighting back in some ways, and these signaling devices give us a method of signaling to society that hey, we're here, we're queer, and we're not going to take it anymore. So yeah, Maddy, I think that's the end of this section.
It is, and that's a really good point to sort of start talking about some of the joy that we found, and I guess some of the frustrations we found in this research, and how it's been taken up, partially because the work really spoke to or attempted to speak to this disruption of the expected palatability of research and the expected palatability of researchers. I think there is a lot of shock that I've seen expressed around just the use of queer as a term, even within this research. But also, of course, with quotes like the last one, the idea that we would say "fuck you" in a presentation, and for people to think that that was some statement beyond just us referring to our participants' contributions. And I think that the palatability or the lack thereof in our research, which stems from that survey response, right? So, why are you even doing this? Through to those quotes that say, fuck the cis-het patriarchy, and really saying that this isn't something that we're saying for shock value. This is something that is emblematic of what joy can mean, joy as rage, particularly in response to this rising tide of hate that we experience, and something that is particularly focalized in higher education, UK higher education in particular, primarily for trans researchers, but also for queer researchers more broadly, this need for us to render ourselves more palatable for general audiences. And I'd like to think that's something we successfully we successfully did, in the sense that, or we successfully didn't do, in the sense that we never tried to amend our research to please general audiences. Because I think that part of our research really was also intended to change the shape of research in terms of what is reasonable, what is considered researchable, and who is considered a good researcher. So the next slide, please, Maddy. This is the fun stuff. So Genavee and I can't help ourselves to do a bit of computational analysis. So we did a little bit of sentiment analysis on Twitter and a little bit of some basic corpus linguistics on Reddit to get a sense of whether the underpinning sentiments or meanings really reflect joy in some of these posts. So we looked at posts that were tagged with queer joy on Twitter or Reddit. So on Reddit, it was through the queer joy subreddit, and on Twitter, it was those tweets that expressly used the phrasing hashtag queer joy. And unsurprisingly, joy was the most frequently expressed, because sentiment analysis is a fairly basic evaluation of sentiment in or emotion in text. But we also had some really interesting things around future orientation, so anxiety and expectation, and also that relationality we see in trust and so distrust, of course. What was really nice, and again, perhaps unsurprising, given that joy was the most frequent, was that disgust was present, even if it was the least expressed emotion. So disgust was something that that did come up in those kinds of things. And again, that negative emotions are themselves relational to the positive emotional or affective orientation of joy, that negative emotions actually serve to enhance joy. And that's why queer rage, I think, is equally important for us to think about in relation to this project. Next slide, please. And this is the corpus analysis, which was the thing that I like to do, because I like to sort of put things in boxes and give them numbers. And again, we found here that lots of representation of relationality, of psychological actions and processes, and of course, those emotional actions and processes. What was really, I think, important in this particular piece of analysis was looking at the engagement data underpinning those Reddit posts, that actually greater engagement came in the form of likes and comments for positive or queer joy focused content, rather than the negatively balanced content. So the idea here being that if platforms were to facilitate or expressly facilitate queer joy, they would also benefit potentially from there being some greater level of engagement. This is also true for personalized content versus depersonalized or abstract content. So it's not enough to talk about queer joy in its abstract form. It's far more about letting users express their own individual queer joy that would or has the potential to generate greater engagement, which of course has some kind of economic impact on those platforms. Next slide, please, Maddy. And so part of this project was developing those policy recommendations. And again, it's the policy recommendations were really about finding a balancing act for platforms. So between, as Genavee mentioned, between privacy and access, between this idea of education versus, I guess, not being extractive, for example. So we were identifying these recommendations as being or requiring a greater consideration of nuance than the average user, and also thinking about how we code in bias to these kinds of platforms in terms of focusing on the average. Next slide, please, Maddy. And some of our conversations with policymakers, we had a policy event in London with some folks from different oversight boards, from Ofcom, and some other colleagues. where we were talking about having, again, not a harms-based framework, but a joy-based framework that really allowed us to think about what the responsibility is of platforms to enhance and facilitate joy. So these are some of the, I guess, the more specific technical impacts we thought need to be considered by policy and platforms. So particularly thinking beyond just users as data banks, allowing porosity in borders, so enabling user controls over identity management and outreach. So of course, some of those platforms like LinkedIn, for example, and Facebook disallow quite often for using a not real name, i.e. something that's not on our government ID. And of course, in the US and also perhaps in the UK in the future, our ID might not match our actual identity. So our physical documentation might not match our identity, in the sense that we have these pushes towards preventing people from expressing themselves, identifying, and of course accessing services, because some people get a bit sad that they perhaps don't have access. Maddy?
Yeah, and just on the privacy thing as well, one of the things we kind of found is people want that kind of granularity, because there's times where you want to very openly share your pronouns in your bio, but then other times that's going to be potentially putting you at risk. And so how do you kind of negotiate being able to be visible in some ways, in some contexts, and not in others? And how can we kind of improve platforms to allow people that granular control over how much of themselves they're having to share?
Absolutely. And because I know I probably should be wrapping up so that we can let questions happen, I just wanted to finish with some slides on the media side of our, or the popular publication side of our project, which was led by Alice Wilson, who wrote various different pieces for Diva, The Conversation, The Egalitarian, Queer AF, and also generated some really interesting podcast interest for the project. And really that focused on our finding of joy in this project too, that this has perhaps been the most joyful project I've engaged with, primarily because my co-investigators are incredible people, but also because it allowed us to test the boundaries of what research could be and feel like. Our distributed leadership approach really enabled us to thrive and to share and develop with one another in skills that we perhaps wanted to have or wanted to share with others. And finding a group of queer and ally researchers who are keen to contribute to the landscape in this area, and to also maximize joy for our audiences, for everyday publics, and for other researchers to see that, and particularly for early career queer researchers, to see that you can have joy in your research, you can enjoy your research, and you can collaborate with colleagues who just get you in a way that perhaps we haven't experienced in other contexts. So perhaps ending this with a little bit of, or at least my part, but I know Jenny wants to come in, with a thank you to my co-investigators for making this a joyful experience and for allowing us to practice the ethics of care that we suggest policymakers and platforms should use in developing their technologies. Genavee?
Yeah, I was just gonna say it has been a really special thing working with everyone, because we all come from very different backgrounds as well. We have artists and computer scientists in the same room. We have, psychologists and linguists in the same room. And although we may not speak exactly each other's language with the same kind of academic vocabulary, I have found that my own research methodology and respect for research in other fields has increased so much, to see how other people do research, and the fact that we can have such similar conclusions from such disparate methods is really amazing. And so for me, that was also kind of like a queering of methodology that we're using in this project. And I just wanted to highlight that, and how exciting it is to be able to get interdisciplinary research funded through the Digital Good Network.
Yeah, and just to echo that, really, like it's been really cool getting to know people and kind of learning all these different ways of going about research. I was quite lucky because Sarah Clinch is actually my PhD supervisor, so we just happened to end up in the same group. So it was really nice getting to kind of keep working with her in this like kind of new area that we hadn't done on my PhD. And for me, this was kind of the first time I'd done any research around my own identity. So that was quite a big, I don't know, journey in and of itself. So it was really cool to have this kind of supportive environment where we got to really kind of explore what research can be, and it doesn't just have to be very impersonal and sitting and doing numbers, even though I love numbers. So yeah, it's just a really great experience.
Exactly. And what I think is really important is that this wasn't a one and done project for us. So we have developed now several different projects, not all of which have been successful in generating money, but several different projects together and in different offshoots as well. So I know that Maddy and Sarah also wrote about queer joy in an HCI context. Maddy, of course, also was first author of the Chi paper that received an honorable award, did I mention, at the Chi conference this year in Japan. And yeah, I think perhaps I speak for the rest of my team. I hope so. That this will be a long-standing collaboration where we'll work together, funding or not, damn it, for a long time.
Amazing. And I'm assuming this is the final slide, and we can probably remove the slides now and move into. Oh, so there are questions, and you can definitely contact Lexi on the email there. Thank you so much. I just wanted to say what a brilliant project this is, and how much I personally have enjoyed listening to this talk. Both in terms of how innovative the methodology is, but also things like the framing, the kind of questioning of, should joy even be researchable? That kind of like actually bringing that thinking to the table as to sort of conceptualizations of some of these concepts and where they come from. So good is something we've been wrestling with, I think, throughout the project, and a sense that an experience such as joy can be part of how we think about the good. I think that's also really very much pushes back against framings of good that are far too narrow, that are really very much grounded in um very sort of I guess heteronormative Western and white male dominated ways of thinking and framing topics and questions. And I think it's important to sort of acknowledge that broader context, which is that queer communities and many other marginalized communities have not really been able to shape knowledge structures and systems for century and millennia. And so the work that we're doing here is to sort of rethink what knowledge is valued and the kind of structures and the systems in which knowledge is valued. And that's obviously it's a much bigger conversation, but I think this conversation is very much part of that conversation. So there's kind of a huge thank you from me in terms of your contribution. Um, and also to flag that we do have kind of some questions. So let's come to the question. So one question comes from Genavee Clickers, who's asking about published materials from studies and bibliography of outcomes from the projects and things that you've cited in this presentation. So I suppose that's a kind of open question about what influenced you in terms of the sort of research and literature that already exists in this place, and do you have plans to publish as well?
It's a really
Yeah.
good question. Sorry, Maddy, you go
Sorry.
first.
Yeah, so I can just drop in the DOI for the survey paper. So that was published this year at the Chi conference. There it is. So that's published, as Lex mentioned, got an honorable mention award. So it was in the 5 top % of papers. For me, that was a very joyful experience, and I got to meet Pikachu, which was pretty much a lifelong dream. So all round careers achieved. So that one's published, I think this week. Dawn is presenting some work around the methods at a conference, and we're hoping to have that in a paper soon. So there's kind of different things in the pipeline for it. But yeah, I'll let Lexi go.
No, that's really great. I was going to highlight the same thing. So Dawn is presenting in Istanbul at a visual methods conference on the creative aspect of the workshop. The Kai paper is out and available for people to read. It's I think a fantastic paper because Maddy and Sarah did a fantastic job. And we also have various things going on, which we're crossing our fingers about coming up soon in terms of trying to generate some more funding to get some more time to do further work on this kind of topic. There's a couple of other presentations we've done. I mentioned that Maddy was invited to the Oxford Internet Institute Pride Lecture this month. They did a fantastic job, and it was great to see them and all the laughs they got during their talk, which was quite nice. A comedian is Maddy. And what we also had, so to respond to that other question that you asked, Rima, in terms of what are the inspirations, there are catchy engagements with queer joy in the literature so far, but a lot of our inspiration actually came from Black joy and Black queer joy. So I think it's really great that you've asked that question because it allows us to give this space to thanking those colleagues that have worked in Black queer joy and given us the general, I guess, philosophical framing of the project, which was to find joy despite oppression, and that actually the biggest act of resistance and resilience is finding joy when others want to oppress us. I can't remember the quote exactly, Maddy, but you might have it.
Joy, I don't know why I tried to off my head. I've got the slides.
Yeah, they've got it. They'll find it. Yeah. And it's by Lewin Steele, I think, is the citation.
Yes, so it was this. So it was by Packnet in 2017 on Twitter, and this is it quoted by Lewin Steele, which is a 2019 paper. And the quote is, "Joy is resistance. Oppression doesn't have room for your happiness. You resist when you find joy anyhow." So yeah, that was quite a big sentiment in it. It might also be worth just shouting out, there's quite a bit of work at the moment in sociology as a discipline around queer joy. So I think it's Wright and Burkholder have quite a lot of projects in Canada around two-spirit LGBTQ plus kind of joy and Indigenous joy. So hopefully this is going to continue to be quite a growing area of research across the globe. And isn't just the kind of, well, I mean, for us, it's not a one and done, but it'll kind of hopefully pick up more traction and we'll get lots more people researching joy.
Absolutely. And of course, Stacey Copeland, who is one of our new collaborators, who's working at the University of Groningen, she does work on queer joy, particularly in audio history, so queer podcasting, lesbian radio history, etc. My Britney Spears headset is dying, so if I stop sounding like I'm making any noise, then I will change my headset in a sec.
Sounds like an amazing headset, but anyway, so one of the questions that I had actually was about the sort of, nature of online spaces themselves, not facilitating or probably optimizing for queer joy in all of its different ways or form. And I was kind of interested to understand a little bit. I mean, these tech platforms, they do operate on an assumption of scale and wanting to get as many people on them. And yet there's something interesting in the sort of sense of there are certain forms of expression that queer communities and people might want to be able to articulate in safe spaces. And I've sort of in the past we've sort of seen that through the emergence of spaces that queer people have created for themselves, whether that's been in public spaces, through Pride, or in bars and in libraries and community centres and so on. Do you think there's any scope for like actually designing bespoke or designated spaces for queer people online, or has any of that kind of come up in your work?
Yeah, that was one of the things that the participants talked about when they talked about this utopia at the workshop, was that what they really wanted was things that the internet didn't provide at the moment. So they wanted a place to meet people that wasn't just about dating. There's lots of queer dating websites, but what about if you just want to meet a friend? who's queer and hang out with them and, have someone you're comfortable with. They talked about wanting spaces where they could find um, queer health information. So oftentimes, on the NHS website, it might be buried, or, there's not medical consensus. So like, where do I go to kind of find this information? They wanted places they could go to get queer history. Um, and that's one thing that we're going to be focusing on our new bid for the digital good network. One thing we're going to try and build is a space for people to have this queer history. But it was really interesting because we came into this thinking, oh, it's just all going to be about expression. But actually, one of the things that people were searching for in Joy was actually information. So, health things, history things, people in their community that they could meet up with, and, queer spaces they could find in the physical world. So I thought that was a really interesting outcome, was finding that, yeah, the current social media landscape does not fit what people are looking for, unfortunately.
Yeah, to jump in on that as well, like there's a few HCI papers that kind of talk about specific queer platforms. There's one for I think it's like Trans Life or something, which does give people those spaces. But half the problem is in order to protect those spaces, they can't be overly advertised. So there's a balance there of actually how do we make these accessible but protect that community. And then there's also, I mean, we've talked quite a bit about queer utopias. There's also a concept in the literature of queer vortexes, where you just kind of create an echo chamber, which even if it's kind of a group of queer people, that's still in some ways a problematic issue. So it's balancing those, what's a utopia, what's a vortex, and how do we create platforms that are allowing healthy discourse without there being negatives in it. So there's a lot of like things that are quite hard to manage in terms of designing platforms.
Brilliant. So Nupa is asking, how can I collect these kinds of data using Instagram platform? So I guess that's a sort of interesting open question, which is should this be collected, in what context, and no, are there tools which can be used for free? So I will sort of see who would like to jump in on that question.
We can, so can you hear me?
Yeah.
Excellent. I've changed to a different little headpiece. So I don't think I'm going to give you advice on which tools to use for free, because I think that free tools are usually not something that I would suggest people use whilst I'm being recorded. But in terms of data that are collectible and whether we should be collecting these kind of data, I'll take that question in terms of it allows us to talk a little bit about the ethics of our project. So one thing that we were really keen on to begin with was not to have anonymity as an absolute default in our work, because when we talk about particularly minoritized and marginalized communities, and we ascribe these or assign these defaults, these ethical defaults for anonymity, we're applying that same kind of cis-heteronormative logic to people's voice, people's agency, and allowing our users to determine the extent of their identifiability was something that was really important to us. When we start scraping data at scale, of course, it becomes easier for us to aggregate information to make people more anonymous. But we're also not necessarily engaging with those mechanisms of consent that allow us to think about whether people want their data used in perpetuity in a different context. So I think that my answer to that question would be, rather than thinking about how, think about whether you should, think about why you would want to collect data at scale. And again, one of the reasons why we decided to have a smaller scale, but multiple different kinds of data collection approach was to enable those nuances in anonymity or identifiability and agency and voice. And Genavee mentioned that to an extent in terms of when participants were able to choose which photos to share with us, particularly if there was some risk, quote, risk, whether it's a risk or not, of identifiability information. Maddy?
Yeah, with reference to Instagram specifically, because I remember Sarah at one point was doing a project around Instagram posts, and within their terms and conditions at the time, it explicitly said you can't scrape this data without permission. So each platform has different governance about how easily you can kind of take those posts to use in research. So it's important to kind of look at each platform, see what's kind of considered public domain and what isn't, and because it's very hard to get explicit consent on those kinds of posts generally. So some of it's implied, some of it is, you know, not there. So, and I think as well, when you're getting into pictures and videos, that's a lot more identifiable than just text posts. So I think there is a level of ethics to consider around whether or not we should just kind of willy-nilly grab those kinds of posts.
I'm glad that we're speaking to the ethics piece. I think that's really, obviously, really important when we're thinking about whose data is being used for what purpose and all of those sorts of questions. So plenty to think about there. So we've got an anonymous question about the idea of joy as resistance. And Lexi shared a little about negative leading to positive outcome. So I think there's a sort of space to explore more about this if you wanted to. Certainly, I think it's probably been one of the most striking themes of this discussion.
Yeah, I think so. We spoke a little bit to that in terms of the underpinning framing from Black joy and Black queer joy, in terms of there being a need for us to find space within systems and spaces of oppression to be joyful. And it was we found it in our research, but we also found it in our Queer Joy Symposium when we asked colleagues from around the world to join us in Southampton to share their research on queer joy in digital spaces, that there was almost a need for negativity for us to find the positivity. So this pushing back, and Genavee mentioned it as well in the creative workshop findings, that there is something that we need to push back against, because queerness is inherently something that disrupts norm. Whether we think about queerness as a gendered or a sexualized aspect, or whether we think about it as just queering a structure with a little q, maybe from, for example, Indigenous perspectives, maybe from Black perspectives, maybe from queer perspectives, it needs normativity to push back against. Now, of course, wouldn't a lovely world be where we didn't have to push back against things? But that's not a reality, and it's unlikely to be a reality anytime in the future. And I think it's far more fruitful, far more joyful even, to think that there is a purpose to joy, and that joy can purposefully be used as challenge in itself. That yes, perhaps sometimes our joy is actually the negative that other people feel. But in fact, us finding that joy is something that we should, we should aim for, and we should use as a way to reflect on, or to disrupt, challenge, deconstruct, and destroy those negative things that require us to meaningfully seek joy in what we do. Maddy.
Yeah, and I mean, historically speaking, you know, the reason we celebrate Pride in June is the anniversary of the Stonewall riots, which was obviously a very negative time with, you know, huge amounts of oppression. And out of that, we now have Pride parades throughout tons of cities. So I think there's just this historical precedent that, you know, from these moments of horrible experiences, we can find joy and we can share it with people.
And what a wonderful note to end on. So thank you so much to all of our speakers. And yes, so happy Pride Month, everyone. And yeah, it's been wonderful to have you with us today. And thank you so much to Lexi, Madeline, and Genavee for all their brilliant work in bringing this project to its forefront. And I look forward to hearing more soon. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.